I'm going to talk to you about taking better portraits with your phone. One of the first things that we need to talk about is how to focus your iPhone. We're going to do a whole lesson on this, but this is important to get started. So how to focus an iPhone. When you aim your iPhone's camera at something, it will focus on what it thinks you want it to be in focus. But it doesn't always pick the right thing, and sometimes you wind up with what we call soft photos. They're not super blurry. They're not super sharp either. One way to nail sharp focus every single time is to tap and hold your finger over the subject that you want in focus. When you do this, a thin yellow focus square appears on screen to let you know that the area that you tapped on is where it's going to focus. You can go ahead and take a shot knowing whatever you tapped on will be a nice sharp focus. There's the focus and recompose trick. When you tap to focus on something in your photo, but then move your camera for a better angle or view, it's very possible that your camera will refocus on something else. That kind of stinks because it's limiting your creativity. You can't recompose your shot the way you want it because your focus might jump to something. That's why you want to know this trick that focuses and locks that focus on your subject. Simply tap and hold the screen for a second or two until you see the yellow focus square and AE/AF lock at the top of the screen. This lets you know that AF autofocus is locked, and so is your exposure, your brightness or darkness of the overall image. Now you can recompose and shoot the way you'd like without worrying about your focus, moving on to something else. Holding your camera still matters. If you really want sharp shots, the one thing to keep in mind when you're shooting is to make sure you're holding your phone still. The darker it is where you're shooting, the more keeping still matters. If it's moving while you're taking the shot, your chances of winding up with a shot that's a little blurry or a lot blurry go way up. Two tricks we use to keep the iPhone still when we're shooting are: number one, tuck your arms in towards your body. This helps stabilize the camera and it will help more than you think. And two, if you can lean against something, anything, a wall, a pole, a column, whatever, or if you can rest your iPhone against something, a table, a glass, an aardvark, etc., does have a built-in stabilization that's always on and definitely helps. But if you can remember to hold it as still as you can while you're shooting, you'll wind up with a lot more sharp, in-focus shots. Next tip, keep the flash on your iPhone turned off. Here's a pro tip. If you want better looking shots, just leave your iPhone's camera's built-in flash turned off all the time. Having a flash that is physically located so close to your camera's lens creates something really unflattering photos, especially of people. It's best to just avoid using flash altogether and either use night mode, available on newer iPhones, or just let the camera automatically expose for the amount of dark that is available, even if it's dark where you're shooting. It does a surprisingly good job in most cases. This isn't just a tip for iPhone cameras. Pros follow the same rules on their traditional camera's built-in flash. Avoid it like the plague. If you were to turn on your flash in some emergency photography situation, hey, it happens. You'll wind up with a driver's license bureau quality image. But at least you know what you'll get. Turn off the flash. On newer iPhones, tap the upward facing arrow at the top of the screen to reveal the camera feature icons near the bottom of the screen, right above your shutter button. The older iPhones appear top of the screen. Tap the flash icon, the lightning bolt, to bring up the flash options, and then tap off. Using the self timer. If you want to take a group photo and you want to be in that group photo too, then you'll want to use your phone's built-in self timer. It gives you a few seconds to get in place, pose with the group before it takes the shot. To turn the self-timer feature on newer iPhones, tap the upward-facing arrow at the top of the screen to reveal the camera feature icons at the bottom of the screen, right above your shutter button. On older iPhones, they appear at the top. The icon looks like a clock. I don't know, maybe it's a stopwatch icon. You'll figure it out. And it brings up options to wait 3 seconds before it takes the shot, 3 seconds, or 10 seconds. Tap the one that you want and it's ready to go. Now when you tap the shutter button, it waits 3 or 10 seconds and then takes the photo for you automatically. If you're holding your phone, use the front-facing camera. You'll see the countdown, 10, 9, 8, 7, and so on, right on the screen. But if you need to sit your camera somewhere and run over and get posed to be in the shot, you're going to see the camera flash every second. And then right before it takes the shot, it blinks really fast. That's your cue to smile. Then you're done shooting in self-timer mode. Tap the clock icon again and then tap off. Note, by default, the self-timer takes shots in burst mode. If you'd rather it didn't, you can turn this off by shooting in live photo or portrait mode. Don't pinch to zoom while shooting. There are 2 types of zoom on your iPhone, good zoom and bad zoom. Good zoom is the one that uses the actual camera lenses on your iPhone. You probably have 2 or 3 depending on the model of your iPhone. When it uses an actual lens, that's called optical zoom. That's the good zoom. You get to this good zoom by tapping the 2x lens at the bottom of your screen, if your iPhone has it. However, since the iPhone doesn't have a bunch of long lenses built in, it allows you to pinch and zoom on the screen for sort of a fake zoom. It's called digital zoom. But the other more common names for it is just bad zoom. Bad zoom is using some whacked digital math stuff. Apparently they haven't quite perfected yet to allow you to get closer in on your subject. You wind up with a closer image, but it's kind of a crappy looking image that's somewhat pixelated and soft. And well, it just ain't great. And the more you use zoom in like this, the worse it looks. So we go out of our way to avoid pinching to zoom when you're shooting. We really only want the zoom that comes from using the zoom lens. Good zoom. Photographing people and still be their friends after they see their shots. Shoot in portrait mode to get that pro look. This is huge. And your phone's secret weapon, because when it comes to portraits, a big advantage that Pro, DSLR, and mirrorless cameras have always had over the iPhone's camera is the ability to blur the background behind your subject. This separates your subject from the background and simplifies the scene by eliminating background distractions, which creates a more professional look. Well, the miracle workers at Apple Engineering came up with a way to create that awesome out-of-focus background using some of the math craziness, and son of a gun if they didn't just nail it. They nailed it so well that it would even fool a pro into thinking the portrait was taken with an expensive high-end camera with a long zoom lens and all the right settings. All you have to do is turn this feature on in the camera app anytime you're about to take a portrait. Just tap and swipe over to the left, right above your shutter button, until the portrait is selected. You need to be about 8 feet away from your subject for it to do its math thing. You actually can get a little closer, but it will warn you at the top of the screen, move farther away. I, for the most part, ignore that if what I see on screen looks like the background's out of focus. Then, if you tap the little F icon in the top right corner of the screen, this is only available on newer iPhones, so if you don't see it, it may not be available on your model. It brings up a slider right above the shutter button. Tap and drag it to the right to add more blur to the background, or to the left to reduce the amount of blur. When it looks good to you, tap the shutter button and take the shot. Now start shooting in portrait mode to get the separation, simplicity, and out of focusness, not even sure if that's a word, but more importantly, to get that pro portrait look. Aiming your camera for portraits. If you've ever seen a person taking selfies, that's a pro at it. You'll notice they all share one particular technique. They hold the phone up over their head, aim it down, and look up at the camera. Why? Because shooting from up high simply makes better looking images. It strengthens the jawline, pulls the skin tight, and creates a much more flattering view overall. That's why when we're taking photos of other people, we ideally shoot from a slightly higher angle, shooting down towards them. Now, depending on your height and the height of a person you're shooting, it may not always be possible. So if that's the case, we try to at least shoot at their eye level. If we can get up higher, you get bonus points. If we can't, eye level is as good as we'll get. But that's not bad. Just make sure you're not shooting from below eye level. Aiming up is the least flattering point of view. Unless, of course, you want to get even with that person for an actual or perceived wrong they did to you at some point, in which by all means. Of course, if you're trying something creative and you can shoot from any angle. But for the tried and true method of where to shoot from this slightly higher angle, they sit, you sit. They stand, you stand. Concept works really well. Where to focus? This one's easy. You focus on your subject's eyes. If they are turned a bit to the side, then focus on the eye that's closest to the camera. So tap the screen directly on one of their eyes, because if their eyes aren't in focus, the whole image will look a bit soft. Composition. Where to put the eyes in the frame. When you're composing your shot, the ideal place for your subject's eyes are to appear 1/3 of the way from the top of the image. So the sweet spot to shoot for. If they're standing close to you, that might have you framing the shot with the top of their head being cut off. But at least you'll know that you've got the shot framed up right. Composition overall. We talked about filling the frame. That's getting close enough to where your subject nearly fills the entire image. That rule is probably the most important with portraits of people. When your subject fills the frame, it brings them closer to the viewer, which helps with connection, and your shot will look more professional all around. One clarification about filling the frame is it's not always necessary to make your subject so close that they actually do fill the frame. Just make sure that you're close enough to your subject so that it's clear that they are the main thing in the photo. The term fill the frame is a bit literal. If your pictures aren't good enough, you aren't close enough. Get in tight and your shots will be that much stronger. Composition. Cutting off the top of the head. Cutting off the top of the head in portraits is a super popular look these days, as long as you cut enough off so it doesn't look like it's a mistake. It should look like you did it intentionally. Otherwise, you'll hear people say, "Oh, that's a nice shot of him. Too bad you cut off the top of his head." It has to be at least 1/3 of their hair or head to where it looks so intentional that nobody questions it. This brings your subjects closer to the person viewing the shot. It makes it more intimate and gives it a more professional look. You'll see this cropping off the top of the head look in ads on the web, magazines, and in product photography, and it's pretty much everywhere. Composition, leaving too much space above the head. This is one of the most common mistakes I see photographers make, and that is leaving too much space above their subject's head. If you follow the rule of thirds about where to position your subject's eye in the frame, you probably won't have an issue with this. But yet, I still see it day in and day out, a big gap between the top of the subject's head and the top edge of the photo. Start by being really cognizant of how much space you leave above your subject's head, and you'll instantly have more professionally looking portraits. Avoid cropping at limbs, losing fingers, etc. This is one of those things that make people uncomfortable when they look at an image. Even if they can't articulate what it is they don't love about the photo, but sometimes they'll tell you straight up, "Too bad you cut off your fingers." When you're framing up a shot or cropping it later in photo apps, be careful not to cut off digits or crop off anyone near any joints. For example, don't crop out the knees. Go well above the knees when you frame your shot for a more natural looking shot. And don't cut your subject off at the ankles, leaving them without feet. And don't cut off the ends of their feet or toes, etc. Another place not to crop is right at the elbow. Either go well above the elbow or well below it when you're framing up the shot, but don't go so low that you cut them off at the wrist. Another big no-no. Stay away from the joints and keep all of their digits and toes intact, and you'll sidestep something that could potentially ruin a great shot. Getting a softer, more blurred background. We love the iPhone's portrait mode for its ability to blur the background behind our subject, separating them from the background for a more, "I shot this with a DSLR" pro look. We looked at the portrait mode, but it's helpful to actually control how blurry the background is when you're not using portrait mode. A big determining factor is how far the subject is from the background they're standing in front of. If your subject is standing right against the wall, maybe 12 inches from that wall, even portrait mode is not going to give you that blurry background effect. But now that you know the distance from the background makes a big difference, if your subject walks a few more feet forward, the farther the better, within reason of course, the more out of focus your backgrounds will be. This kills more portraits than anything. Let's say you have a friend in front of you. You're about to take their portrait. You've got good light. Your friend looks nice. The scene looks nice. So what is the most likely thing that will destroy your shot? Simply put, it's something distracting in the background. Bad backgrounds with distracting things in them kill more portraits than anything else, which is why keeping an eye on the background is so critically important. Pros know that keeping the background clean and simple is a very important ingredient in the recipe for a great portrait. This is one huge reason why we're so big on making the background out of focus in our portraits. A portrait is about a person, and if our eyes are drawn to the background, the portrait has essentially failed. One big thing to avoid is where you see text in the background. Our minds are programmed to immediately read text in an image first, and then we look to the subject to see how that person ties into the text. Normally they don't. And so you wind up with a disjointed experience for the viewer. Just remember, you're looking at the subject, but the viewer sees everything in the photo. So keep an eye on that background. Clean, simple, uncluttered. If you can't find that in your background, turn on your iPhone's portrait mode to help with the background stuff so that it's not too distracting. Why direct sunlight is our enemy. We want people to look great in our photos, right? Part of making them look great is not shooting them in harsh, unflattering light. Where does harsh, unflattering light come from? The sun. The sun is the nastiest little ball of bad light, and besides making your subject squint, which in itself isn't a good look, the main bad thing it does is create harsh shadows on your subject's face. Those hard shadows are not flattering. So we go out of our way either to get our subjects out of the sun or at least get them somewhere the sun isn't directly on them. Most of this section is about just that, using techniques that pro photographers use to make their subject look their very best no matter what the lighting situation is. Look, we're going to be doing a lot of shooting outdoors in sunlight, and actually that's where the iPhone really shines in well-lit situations. But just know that our job is not to put our subjects in direct, nasty, harsh light situations. So keep this one big, overriding thought in mind. I want light that flatters my subjects, and it's up to me, the photographer, to make sure they get that light. If you have to shoot in direct sunlight, do this. Sometimes we can't get around shooting in direct sunlight. Maybe there's no available shade nearby, or you don't have a diffuser. But basically, you want to make a portrait. What do we do to make a shot really nice? Two things. Place your subjects back towards the sun. This gets them out of the direct light. The sun is behind them. So it already takes the squinting away. And you've added the bonus of the sun lighting the back of their hair. It's like you're using the sun as a second light, a hair light, and that backlit look is really pleasing and really popular. Now, your subject's face is going to look fairly dark because the sun isn't hitting them, it's behind them. So, to get around that, you're going to tap on their face on your iPhone screen and lock the focus and exposure for their face. Then tap and drag upward, which brightens their face. Or if you have an iPhone 11 or newer, you can tap the upward facing arrow at the top of your screen to reveal the camera feature icons right above your shutter button. Tap on the exposure compensation icon, the circle with the plus and minus signs, and then tap and drag the slider to the left to increase the exposure. Just drag up to the left enough to where the light on their face looks nice and balanced. This will also make your background brighter. Dragging upward to the left makes the whole photo's exposure brighter. Which is why it's ideal if you can position your subject in some kind of dark behind them, like some trees. Because if the background gets a little bright, who cares? The most important thing is that the subject's face has the right brightness. This is a great recipe for success when you need to shoot out in direct sunlight. The trick to shooting under a tree. Why would you want to shoot under a tree? Because if you're shooting under a tree, you're not in direct sunlight. So it's a favorite location for photographers to make portrait. Okay, sounds reasonable. Why do we need a trick? Well, we need a trick to avoid the biggest issue we have when shooting under a tree, which is the little bits of sunlight that peek through the tree and all those little bits of light that land on your subject. Unless you're shooting under a tree that has incredibly dense leaves, this is going to happen. In fact, it happens so often that we have a name for it. It's called dappled light. We don't want dappled light as seen on the left. We want nice, even light on our subjects as seen on the right. And the trick to avoiding dappled light is to hold your iPhone up in a shooting position, and if you see those little bits of dappled light hitting your subject, keep your phone in place and have your subject move a foot or so in one direction or the other. You're basically going to move them until you see on screen that the dappled light goes away. This is surprisingly easy to do. It usually takes about 20 to 30 seconds to get them out of the dappled light area and into an area under the tree where you have full shade, no dapples. Give this a try the next time you're shooting under a tree, and you'll see what a difference it makes with the quality of your final image. When is the best time to shoot? The easiest way to get great portraits outdoors is to shoot at the time of day when the sun is low in the sky. The shadows it creates are soft and flattering, and the color from the light and the sun is warm and pleasing. That time of day is an hour or so before sunset, called golden hour because the light is specular at that time. You don't have to do any special camera tricks, and you don't need a diffuser or any of that stuff. You just need to have yourself and your subject out and ready to shoot at that golden hour. Yes, you might need to put their back to the sun depending on where it is in the sky, and you might need to do that trick where you increase the brightness of the subject's face by tapping and dragging upward on your iPhone screen or using an exposure compensation slider. Get your subjects out there in golden light and the rest will take care of it. Why shooting on cloudy days rocks. We know that direct sunlight is a recipe for squinty, harsh shadows on the face, ugliness type of portrait, right? But if you wind up shooting on a really cloudy or overcast day, those clouds act like diffusers because the direct sunlight isn't coming through. The clouds act as a natural softbox. The light is softer and more flattering. The main point is that cloudy days rock when it comes to shooting during the middle of the day because you'll get smoother, softer shadows and it's generally nicer results. Plus, it won't be as hot if it's a hot time of year.